The room is quiet. A single lamp casts a warm glow across the wooden floor. Outside, the wind moves gently through the trees. Inside, there's only stillness. Have you ever sat alone in silence and felt at ease? Not sad, not lonely, just still. A kind of peace that doesn't need permission. A space where the world feels distant, yet you're fully present. Many men after the age of 50 begin to choose this kind of life. Not because they've lost something, not because they've given up, but because they've discovered something deeper. Solitude, on their own terms. This isn't a story about retreat. It's a story about clarity. And today we're going to explore why so many men quietly and without apology choose to live in silence, not sadness. There's a quiet but important difference between being alone and feeling alone. Two words often mistaken for each other, solitude and loneliness, but they live in different worlds. Solitude is a choice. It's the decision to step away to be with yourself, not because the world shut you out, but because you need space to breathe. It's the kind of silence that fills you, not empties you. The kind of stillness where your thoughts settle like snow in a shaken globe, finally drifting back into place. Loneliness, on the other hand, is not about being without people. It's about being without connection. You can be surrounded by noise, by laughter, even by friends, and still feel unseen. It's not the absence of company. It's the absence of belonging. Picture this. A man walks alone through the forest at sunrise. No one else is near. The leaves rustle beneath his feet. The air is crisp. He isn't lonely. He's present. Now imagine someone else standing in a crowded room, voices everywhere, laughter glasses clinking, but his eyes stay distant. His smile fades quickly. That man is not alone, but he is lonely. So when a man chooses solitude, it doesn't mean he's broken or retreating. It may simply mean he has found a place where he doesn't have to explain himself anymore. And in that space, peace begins. There comes a point in life, often after 50, when the noise begins to fade. The children have grown and left home. The house feels quieter, not just in sound, but in rhythm. A long career may be behind them. Retirement becomes more than a date, it becomes a mirror. For some, it follows the end of a marriage. For others, a slow realization that the pace they've kept for decades no longer fits the man they are today. This is the threshold of midlife, a transition not marked by celebration but by reflection, not a crisis but a calling, a quiet urge to look inward, to ask questions without needing answers right away. For many men, this period is a return, not to youth but to self. They step away from what the world expected of them because for so long they've been providers, protectors, problem solvers. They've held steady under pressure, worn the mask of strength even when tired. But now they allow themselves to be still, not weak, not lost, just still. They no longer feel the need to explain their worth, no longer chase titles or recognition. They begin to find joy in the ordinary, the sound of a page turning in a book, the way morning light stretches across the kitchen table, the quiet hum of birds outside the window. Some return to passions once put aside. They pick up a guitar gathering dust. They walk trails they forgot they loved. They sit with music not to fill silence but to enjoy it. This isn't isolation, it's space. And in that space many men begin to hear themselves again, perhaps for the first time in years. Sometimes the decision to live alone doesn't come all at once. It arrives quietly after life has rearranged itself in ways no one planned. For many men, the shift begins with loss, the end of a long marriage, a divorce that leaves more silence than anger, or the passing of a partner, someone who once filled the room with laughter and memory. Suddenly, the house becomes larger than it used to be, the calendar emptier, the evenings longer. Then comes the pressure, often invisible but deeply felt. Questions from others, well-meaning but persistent. Are you seeing anyone? Don't you get lonely? Maybe it's time to move on. Society often carries expectations, especially for men at this stage in life. To rebuild, to stay strong, to appear fulfilled. But many quietly resist that script, not out of bitterness but because they've grown tired of performing. As the years go on, the circle of connection naturally changes. Old friendships fade, new ones are harder to form, but the few that remain become deeper, more intentional. It's not about how many people are in your life, it's about who truly understands you. And the truth is, not every man finds it easy to open up. For some, speaking their feelings feels unnatural. So instead of forcing words that won't come, they choose silence. They choose quiet mornings, unspoken routines, and the kind of solitude that doesn't demand explanation. This isn't withdrawal, It's self-protection, a way of living that honors peace over performance. And though it may appear distant from the outside for many men, it feels more honest than anything they've lived before. It's easy to misunderstand a man who chooses a quieter life. From the outside, it might look like distance, like retreat, but stillness is not surrender. There's a difference between stepping back and giving up. Choosing to live alone, to embrace simplicity, to seek silence, these are not signs of despair. They are decisions, deliberate, measured, often hard-earned. Men, especially as they grow older, tend to carry their emotions inward, not because they feel less, but because they've been taught to hold more. They process quietly, they reflect deeply, and when the world becomes too loud, they don't always push back. Sometimes they simply step aside. In that space, something new begins to form. Some start to write not to be read, but to release. Others find peace in movement, long walks through forest trails or along quiet streets at dawn. Some give their time to causes that matter, not for applause, but for meaning. These are not the choices of someone who has given up. They are the choices of someone who has begun to listen more closely to what truly matters. No longer chasing, no longer proving, just being. And in that there is quiet strength. His name is Mike. He's 61 years old and lives just outside a small town in Utah where the mountains rise quietly behind his cabin. A few years ago, his life changed in an instant. His wife passed away after a long illness, and with her so much of what was familiar also disappeared. For a while, people reached out, friends, neighbors, distant relatives, but Mike didn't respond the way they expected. He didn't join support groups. He didn't fill his calendar with new plans. Instead, he withdrew from social media. He sold their home in the suburbs. He moved closer to the mountains, to a place where the wind carried no questions. Some assumed he was grieving in silence. Others whispered that he had fallen into sadness. But the truth was more complex and more peaceful. Each morning, Mike wakes before sunrise. He sits by the window with a cup of tea and meditates in stillness, not chasing thoughts, not escaping them, just noticing. A few days each week, he writes. His blog doesn't go viral. It doesn't need to. He writes for himself and for the quiet handful of readers who understand what it means to choose a life less crowded. And once a month he drives into town. There at the local clinic he volunteers, filing records, bringing coffee to nurses, sometimes just sitting with someone who doesn't want to be alone while they wait for news. Mike's story isn't about loss. It's about what can grow in the space that follows. He didn't give up. He simply chose something different. And in doing so, he found a version of peace that many spend their whole lives chasing. We often judge what we don't understand. When a man chooses to live alone, it's easy to assume he must be lonely, that he's waiting for someone, that he's missing something. But not all silence is a cry for help. Sometimes silence is a form of healing. We shouldn't be so quick to label a quiet life as incomplete. For many men, solitude isn't a signal of sadness. It's a conscious decision, a return to something real. Living alone can be an act of rebuilding, of putting the pieces back together without rushing. It can be the space where a man finally meets himself again. Not the version shaped by others, but the version shaped by time, reflection, and truth. This isn't about isolation. It's about presence. Being where you are, with no need to perform. So before you assume the man who sits quietly at family gatherings is unhappy, before you wonder why he doesn't call as often, ask yourself, have you truly tried to understand him? Have you asked not with pressure but with patience? Maybe that quiet man, your father, your uncle, your brother, has found a peace you haven't noticed. Not because he explained it, but because he no longer feels the need to. If you're living alone and it feels right, know this, you are not alone in your choice. There are others walking the same quiet path, not out of sadness but out of clarity. And if there's a man in your life who speaks less than he used to, maybe your father, your brother, or a close friend, take a moment. Start with a simple, honest question. Not to fix anything, just to listen. Sometimes the most meaningful connections begin without noise. If this message spoke to you, consider subscribing to the channel. Here we explore the emotional journey of men in midlife, thoughtfully, respectfully, and without judgment. And if you have a story of your own, you're welcome to share it in the comments. Your voice may be exactly what someone else needs to hear.